The Hatchet Murders by Nancy Roberts. The Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast Museum, where controversy still continues as to Lizzie's guilt or innocence. Sheets of rain wrapped the car, obscuring Phil's view of Interstate 95, and drops fell with a staccato rap on the roof of the new Chrysler van as Phil and Marcy made their way from Wareham to Providence. Marcy wiped mist from the inside of the window beside her. "It is really bad, Phil. Why don't we just stop somewhere and spend the night?" "It isn't that far to your sister's now. We can just be there in another 2 hours if the rain lets up." "And if it doesn't?" "Phil, the radio just said the storm is on the edge of a hurricane, and Fall River exit should be coming up soon. Let's just turn off there." "And stay where?" "I don't know anything about Fall River." "For some reason, the name sounds familiar," said Marcy. "We could try a bed and breakfast. That would be a pleasant part of our trip." Marcy Rollins, only you would think of making a funeral trip pleasant. "Well, we don't need 2 funerals. Ours from having an accident in this downpour, and my brother-in-law's, too." "That's true. Does Cindy need your help tonight?" "I don't really think so. Bob's sisters are there at the house." Another barrage of rain pummeled the van, and the headlights of their cars became more difficult to see between the rivulets of water on the window. "I'm going to give her a call on the car phone and tell her about the weather, Phil. Isn't the Fall River exit coming up?" "Yes, I'm going to take it." The answer at the first bed and breakfast was not encouraging. "We don't even have that small room left, do we, Amy?" the owner asked his teenage daughter. She shook her head. "People leaving the interstate to get out of the storm, I guess." "Do you have any suggestions?" asked Phil. "There's the one at 230 2nd Street, suggested the girl. "Of course, they're nearly always full up, but you could try them." She suddenly giggled and said, "If you don't mind staying there." Her father gave her a reproving look. His directions were clear, and a few minutes later they were peering through the rain at the front of the austere 2-story frame house. Narrow as it had looked when they drove up, it went back farther from the street than they had realized and was actually quite spacious. "You're lucky tonight," said George quickly at the desk. "We usually have reservations a long time ahead, especially during the month of August, but these people—" He tapped a name on his register. "I'm sorry to say they've had a death in the family and had to cancel. We can give you their room. It's the guest room, the one where Abby Borden's body was found." "Bad weather out there tonight, isn't it?" he commented, shaking his head. "How about some cold cider for you, or milk, or our homemade cookies? We have pears, too, of course." "Milk and cookies sound great," said Marcy, placing her suitcase beside the stairs. "Wasn't the way he said pears strange?" she said to her husband after their host had left for the kitchen. "I didn't think much about it one way or the other." The milk and cookies appeared almost instantly, and the Rollinses sat down on a black horsehair sofa. "The furnishings of this house are remarkable," exclaimed Marcy, reaching for a cookie. "Oh, do you like them? We researched to find authentic pieces from the 1850s, said Martha McGinn, one of the owners. "Some of the furnishings were either original to the Borden house or are very similar in style." "Oh, look at this cookie. What a strange shape," exclaimed Marcy. "Don't be rude, honey. It must be for Washington's birthday," said her husband. "In August?" exclaimed Marcy. "Hatchet-shaped cookies are one of our specialties, and of course, August is special too, since today is the 4th. We've had our anniversary reenactment of the Hatchet murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. I'm sure you've read about the famous crime." "A crime here?" Marcy said breathlessly. "Now we understand if that makes you nervous, Mrs. Rollins," said Kathy Goncalo, who worked at the desk. And we have a list of our other bed and breakfast places around. Phil could hear the moan of the wind and the rain beating against the windows, and he had visions of driving through it to discover that accommodations were non-existent. Of course, they could drive back to the highway to one of the chain motels. "We really aren't nervous," he said with a smile. "Well, sometimes people are, especially with the history of this house, you know." "I'm not," said Marcy. "I think it's absolutely fascinating. I love mysteries." "I thought that might be why you and Mr. Rollins came here." "Actually, we're refugees from the storm," said Marcy. "So it wasn't because you wanted to spend the night at the Lizzie Borden bed and breakfast after all?" "Lizzie Borden? That name sounds familiar," said Phil. "Oh, yes," said Marcy. "I remember it all. Poor Lizzie was suspected of murdering her father and stepmother. Now I know why the name Fall River had such a familiar ring when I saw the sign on the interstate. And that's the reason for the hatchet-shaped cookies." "I don't see why it should upset us now," said Phil. "It all happened over 100 years ago, didn't it?" "Oh, yes, 105 years ago this month. I'm glad you and your husband aren't scared, Mrs. Rollins. I think what bothers people the most is not that there was a double murder here, but that it occurred in such a gruesome way. As if people consider some murders not as bad as the others," said Marcy thoughtfully. "That's an interesting idea, isn't it, Phil?" "Not to me, Marcy. I feel horror over every murder. It breaks one of the laws of God. I'm not sure I'll ever understand your interest in crimes." "It's just that I'm fascinated by any type of mystery, you know that. Especially one that has never really been solved," said a guest who was sitting in a nearby easy chair listening. "Hope you don't mind my interruption, but everyone has a different theory. Mr. Rollins, is that right? My name is Bernard Breckenridge." "How do you do?" said Phil. Breckenridge continued. "And they say that after it happened, some couples actually divorced over disagreements about who did it. Imagine that." "How ridiculous," said Marcy. "Let me show you some of the interesting things in the house, Mrs. Rollins," said George, offering them cider, cookies, and fruit. "Why don't you take this pair up to the bedroom with you, Mr. Rollins? You may decide you need a snack later." Phil Rollins hesitated. "Do take it. We always keep plenty of pears on hand. It was Lizzie's favorite fruit, and, well, she said she was eating pears out in the yard under the tree at the time the Bordens were murdered." "But I thought she was supposed to have," began Marcy. "Killed them," said longtime employee Kathy Goncalves. "No one really knows, and probably never will. Lizzie was certainly a prime suspect, but she had a good lawyer and was acquitted." "And what do you think, Mr. Breckenridge?" asked Marcy curiously. "I'm not sure. Sometimes I think she did it alone, and sometimes I wonder if she didn't have an accomplice, a man whom she began to fear later. Everyone has a different opinion." "We'll have a tour of the house in the morning," said George, "and point out where all the members of the family and the maid were supposed to have been when the crime took place. Why don't you stay and see what you and your husband think, Mrs. Rollins?" "Wouldn't that be terrific, Phil?" "We don't have time, Marcy. Maybe we can come back again. If it's not too late for you, Mrs. Rollins, let me take you through the house now and show you our modest library of books and crime scene photos." "Do you mind, Phil?" "Go ahead. I know you want to, Marcy. I'll go up to the room and read USA Today." Fine, honey, I'll see you soon. Are you sure this won't bother you before retiring, Mrs. Rollins? Not a bit. Let's go. Phil took their luggage up to the bedroom. It was really like walking into the world of his grandparents, he thought, as he gazed at the old-fashioned furniture. Everything was just perfect. The bed and its pillows edged with crocheted lace, the bureau of cloth, a white linen towel with a fringe, all very quaint. He was glad now that they had stopped here. He put the newspaper on the bureau and placed a small alarm clock from his overnight bag on the bedside table. A meticulous man and an experienced traveler, he never trusted the clocks in the room or a wake-up call anywhere he stayed. Then he took out his pajamas and fresh clothing for the following day. Suddenly, he noticed that the room was cold. It had not been chilly when he came in. Well, no matter. He would just lay his new L.L. Bean robe across the chair to put it on while he sat and read. He began to unbutton his shirt, and as he did so, turned toward the old-fashioned oak bed. His finger stopped at the second button. His hands began to tremble. The appearance of the bed was very different from only a few minutes ago when he entered the room. Instead of the coverlet being perfectly smooth, it was now quite rumpled. But that was not the important change. Its folds were rearranged so that they corresponded to the curves of a body, and it was not a slim body. On the pillow he saw an indentation that could only have been made by a human head. Marcy returned to find her husband sitting fully dressed in the downstairs sitting room. His face was very pale. "Why are you down here?" she asked in surprise. "I thought you'd be up in bed by now, honey." "Marcy, come upstairs. I want to show you something when you go in." She stared at him in bewilderment as he put the key in the door of their room. "If something is wrong, why don't you just tell the owners? I'm sure they'll take care of it." "Because I thought you should see this first. Look at that bed." Dramatically, he flung the door wide open and stood aside while she proceeded into the room. "I'm looking. What's the matter?" she said a bit impatiently. The bed is what the..." He stopped in mid-sentence. The pillow was plumped up, and the coverlet was smooth as it had been when he first entered the room where Abby Borden was resting when she was brutally murdered more than 100 years ago. The next morning, Phil sat in embarrassed silence while Marcy related his experience over a hearty breakfast of oatmeal, orange juice, eggs, sausage, and Johnny cakes. "Oh, how wonderful. Why doesn't something like that ever happen to me?" moaned one guest. "I've heard some people have woken up in the night to see a woman in Victorian clothes dusting the furniture, and some have had her straightening the blankets over them as they lay there." Martha McGinn noticed that Phil Rollins' face was quite white, and he did not seem interested in his food. "Incidents are sometimes reported here by the staff, but seldom by guests," she said comfortingly. "People who work in the house say they hear the sound of footsteps or doors opening and closing mysteriously, but I think any spirits we have around here are now friendly ones. Visitors like to discuss their theories about the crime, and they ask lots of questions." "I have my own ideas of what happened," said Marcy. "I scanned some of the books and bought a transcript of the inquest documents. You should read it, Phil. I think I know who murdered both of them, and it wasn't Lizzie at all." The Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast Museum is thought to be a house active with spirits. Some guests have reported hearing voices, and the sound of a woman weeping. Others tell stories of unexplained footsteps and doors mysteriously opening and closing. In addition to reservations for overnight accommodations where you can rent a single room, a whole floor, or even the entire house. The Borden house is open 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. 7 days a week year-round, except Thanksgiving Day and Christmas Day. Tours depart every hour on the hour. The house is located at 230 2nd Street, Fall River, Massachusetts. It was 92nd Street during the Borden tenure, but the house number was changed in 1896, notably to disassociate it from its macabre history. The end.